Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I am your host, Rajni Gamage, a research fellow at the Institute. Sri Lanka's national budget for 2025 was presented by President Anura Kumara Dissanayake last month. This is the inaugural budget under the National People's Power or NPP government, which came into power in November 2024. To help us understand the political and economic implications of the budget, I am joined today by Mr. Umesh Moramudali, lecturer at the Department of Economics, University of Colombo in Sri Lanka. Thank you for joining me today, Umesh.
It's a pleasure to be here, Rajni.
So, to start the conversation, we see this budget trying to work within the constraints of the IMF program that the country entered into in 2023 and to work within the narrow fiscal space following the 2022 economic crisis. So, how much and in what ways do you see this government operating within the constraints of the IMF framework?
I think they are fairly well within the IMF program and the parameters set by the IMF. President himself very categorically mentioned in the budget speech quite a few times that the budget was prepared having the 2.3 primary surplus target in mind. So that's quite clear they are adhering to that. And then we also see in addition to adhering to the 2.3% primary surplus target, Sri Lanka is also adhering to the other primary expenditure limit that are stipulated in the Public Financial Management Act that was recently introduced under the IMF program. We see a little bit of an increase in the capital expenditure for about 2.7% of GDP to 4%. This is largely due to the fact that Sri Lanka will recommence a lot of the infrastructure projects, rather the foreign funded infrastructure projects that were halted during the period of default. For example, the Central Expressway, that for that the funding was provided by China Exim Bank, that was halted because Sri Lanka did not have money to provide what we call as a counterpart funding, the funding that comes from the government, and also the China Exim Bank also sort of halted the payments because Sri Lanka was in a default status. That was the case with a lot of other lenders as well. That is the usual procedure when a country is in default. Now, as we have upgraded from the default status, as we have completed the debt restructuring, now those projects will recommence, and it's been announced. Japan also signed a debt moratorium, and they also said previously that they will recommence providing uh, the money for the loans that they have committed. So the Japanese funded projects will commence, and I think Chinese also very clear that their Chinese funded projects will commence. And as we're speaking, I think there's a delegation of China Exim Bank in Sri Lanka negotiating or discussing about how to proceed with these halted projects. So a lot of those will come the increase of capital expenditure. We don't see much significant increase in the primary expenditure. We see the recurrent expenditure pretty much remaining in the same amount. It was 17.8% in 2024, and it is expected to be in the 17.8% in 2025. We, however, have a salary increment, fairly big salary increment on individual basis for the public servants, and that cost about estimated that cost about 110 billion rupees for 2025. And that is an amount that Sri Lanka can absorb while adhering to IMF targets, and that is why the salary increments are not provided at one go. The salary increments are provided on 3 years. So in 2025, there's a part of salary increment coming, 26 and 27. So the salary increments will be concluded in 2027. They're not providing salary increment at one go so that they can meet the IMF target. So overall, all in all, the budget is designed to be very much in line with the IMF targets. And I would go so far to also say that it's the premise of the budget. It wasn't a budget that was prepared a lot with delivering on radical promises or most of the things that any government would do, any populist things. Mostly it started with the IMF targets, and then the government seems to have tried to plug in whatever that they can do. So the basic structure is the IMF parameters, and within which they have tried to accommodate whatever they can. Yeah, so that would be my answer.
So you were mentioning in your response about the increase in salary payments to public sector servants. I would like to go a bit further into that. In addition to public service salary increments, which you mentioned have been done in a phased process, and so therefore can be absorbed by the government, we have also seen a large section of the expenditure being allocated to the prepayment or the payment of debt associated with the Sri Lankan Airlines, a state-owned enterprise. And there has been a significant amount of criticism with this government's attempt to salvage this Sri Lankan Airlines. So, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think first of all, I wouldn't categorize that as a big amount. It's just 20 billion that they've allocated. And President specifically mentioned that the government is not giving any money to Sri Lankan Airlines to manage their day-to-day operations. This money is allocated specifically to pay the pay the loans that the Sri Lankan airline had taken. So I wouldn't categorize 20 billion as an amount that affects the budget significantly. It doesn't, in my view, on a larger context. But still, 20 billion is quite a large sum when you take other expenditures. For example, the government had allocated 3 billion to import new buses, new low flow sort of buses to Sri Lanka to be operated under Sri Lanka state-owned transport board. Now you could see that these buses would actually facilitate easy travel for a lot of average Sri Lankans, and 3 billion goes to that, and 20 billion goes to repay debt for the Sri Lankan Airlines, which is the national carrier, and an average person would barely benefit from that. So there's that question whether this 20 billion is worth. I think for me, the larger question is what is this government hoping to do with Sri Lankan Airlines? I am not the type of person who takes a very neoliberal view that would say that okay, government shouldn't do any business or sell everything that it owns. I don't hold that opinion. But in terms of Sri Lankan Airlines, I think that's been quite a burden for successive governments. And I think this government has to take a clear decision as how they're going to approach this. My personal opinion would be not to maintain it. It's airline is not an easy business for anyone to run, and certainly government like Sri Lanka that has many fiscal constraints should not be trying to run it at this stage, is my opinion. And then the I think the question then is how to find an investor and sell it or restructure it or enter into a private public partnership, so on and so forth. My question is, I don't think the government had seriously looked into that. So far, their policy on this has not been very clear. They've pretty clearly stated that they are not going to uh, do significant changes to strategic SOEs such as Ceylon Electricity Board or any further changes to Ceylon Petroleum Corporation. They have already gone to certain reform processes, though. Um, so overall, for me, the concern and the worry, and what I want to highlight is that how they're gonna approach the Sri Lankan airline next year or in general. Because selling this airline, which has been making losses, to a private sector or finding a partner or restructuring, that is also not easy. Right, that is also a fact to be understood. It's not like you're trying to sell Qatar Airways or Singapore Airlines to another investor, which are high-end airlines. So Sri Lankan Airlines is does not fall under that category. When you have a balance sheet that of a company that is not really looking good, it's incredibly difficult to find investors or restructure it or sell it altogether. So I think the government has to really look into that as to what to do. There's previous government looked into this. Uh, some of the uh, the conclusions can be drawn from those reports as well. But I think that has to happen. So my hope is that I understand that this may not be immediately possible, but I would hope that by next year, when they present the budget next year, we wouldn't be talking about the same issue.
Yes. We also have sectors such as health, education, and nutrition that are severely underfunded as well, and which received a major hit from the 2022 economic crisis as well. So we see that this budget allocates more funds to some of these areas, such as the health and education sectors. And we also see this budget adding to the Aswasuma program. So what are your opinions on these allocations? And do you think that they are sufficient to address some of the systemic inequalities that persist within these sectors?
It's a tough question to answer because we are talking about a budget over 1 year and deep-rooted problems that last for years and that will take years to resolve. So no, I don't think it's sufficient, but I also understand the constraints that this government or any government for next, let's say, 5 to 10 years that would face in addressing those. Because Sri Lanka's central problem for last 20 years or so has been we are having very low tax revenue. And even after increasing taxes, our tax revenue is very much lower compared to the average of middle income countries. That is around, I think, 20%. Sri Lanka is, even after tax increases in this year, we would still be around 15%, still a lot below. And we used to be around 10%, 11%. So that is our problem. And with having that problem, it's incredibly difficult to increase funding to any sector. And we've seen that what happened when you do that in 2005 to 15 era, when there was not much funding allocated for the health or education, but there was a lot of funding allocated for the infrastructure development, including the non-essential ones. And that sort of led to a debt crisis that we experience. I think for me, it's about having a clear plan how to address these issues. I think they could have allocated a little bit more to health and education on certain specific matters. Watching the debate on the education sector, where I've seen they've highlighted that the government has allocated some money to provide sanitary facilities to some of the rural schools and so on and so on. So those are good things, those are important things. So I would like to see that kind of things more to enhance the quality of the education and enhance the quality of the health services and the medicine that the people receive. Um, for me, uh, there's also, before I go into the next point, I want to highlight that currently there's a significant support, substantial support from some international organizations to address the issues pertaining to particularly the nutrition side, nutrition or the access to food side in Sri Lanka because the crisis severely affected that. For example, World Food Program as a program through which the meals, I think the the breakfast is provided to students, especially in the ones in the rural schools. So that kind of sort of things are already there. So then the question is how the government going to complement some of those things, and also the government cannot really provide relief for everyone. It's only for those who need. My my major point on this question would be how to address existing structural issues within the health and education sector in particular. And there are issues in you mentioned Asra, I'll come to that separately. In the health and education sector, if you resolve a lot of structural weaknesses, which may not take a huge amount of money, it's not like building a new hospital or anything. If you resolve some of the structural weaknesses, within, or rather the institutional weaknesses or the procedural weaknesses, then you will have the substantial amount of issues being resolved in coming 2 to 3 years. The truth is, in the upcoming 2 to 3 years, any government would not be able to allocate significant amount of money, rather would not be able to increase the allocation significantly. That's the so so you allocate for the essential things, and while you strengthening the system, make the institutions and procedures more efficient. For example, recently we saw the unfortunate incident with a female doctor facing being raped in her quarters in Anuradhapura. So that kind of a addressing those sort of things, the improve the facilities for the healthcare workers, because we are facing a huge crisis in terms of healthcare workers leaving the country, and improving their facilities, and then being much more systematic about it. Those things wouldn't take insane amount of money, but those things can be done, but it requires just the political will and the understanding the structures to address it. And then we also see a lot of regulatory issues within the education sector. If you address those, some of the issues will actually be resolved. I know for a fact that there are a lot of issues in the university system. It doesn't require money to address those. Sometimes it doesn't require money at all. Sometimes it requires a very small amount of money to address those concerns. And I think it's important that the government trying to address those procedural and structural issues, because if you don't address those, even if you increase the funding, that wouldn't serve the purpose of enhancing the quality of education or health and providing a better service for particularly for the poorer segment of the society. So that won't happen unless you fix those. So I think the best government can do is do that. I mean, I don't expect the budget to look into that specifically, but I think that is what is required uh, to ensure that the budget allocations are properly utilized. In terms of Asasuma, I don't think there's been a lot increase of allocations of the money, but I think the issues with Asasuma is that there are issues in terms of selection, inclusion, and exclusion errors, and whether particularly the welfare benefit board that carries out these cash transfers, whether they have sufficient capacity, whether there's proper monitoring mechanisms. So for me, the key is again strengthening the system, strengthening the institution, and then link this system with the Samurdhi. Currently, Samurdhi is not operating alongside the welfare benefit board. They are in a tug of war. I think the reality is that you cannot feed in social protection if institutions working in silos. So that cannot happen. And then the welfare benefit board, which is a new institution, in my opinion, does not have sufficient capacity to do what they do. They're right now doing a very good job. It's difficult for them to do with a limited capacity, right? They're actually technically handling the largest data set, probably one of the largest data sets in Sri Lanka, of around like 4 million people, because 4 million people submitted applications, and then that entire data set they had to handle. And even right now, maybe around 2 million people are getting it. So the selection, distributing cash transfers, so on and so forth. All those things and continuous improvement of it, structural improvement requires capacity, requires political will to look into that. I personally don't think that the government had looked into it at all, to be honest. I think that's an area that they should look into, because merely allocating money to meet the IMF targets in terms of social protection wouldn't really serve the poor. If you want to address the inclusion exclusion errors and actually find out who are poor, and ensure the upward social mobility, you have to carry out certain reforms within some of the increase the capacity of the welfare benefit board to ensure that it does a good job. So for me, the answer lies there.
So, so far we were focusing more on the expenditure side of the budget and moving on to the revenue generating measures that the budget hints at or proposes. The big question that I have is whether the budget has a clear plan in terms of how it will chart a path for economic growth and how it will generate revenue to um, spend on these sectors that it has committed to. And in your previous response, you were mentioning how a lot of the challenges that government institutions face is more in the procedural aspects of it. And we saw that even within the budget, there's a significant focus in terms of digitalizing tax systems as well as administrative reforms to improve efficiency of the state sector. So, in your opinion, is this sufficient? What is your take on this?
I mean, I wouldn't expect budget to answer all these questions. It's really just about whether the money is being allocated for right things for the next year or not, and borrowing limits, so on and so forth. But on an overall context, there is some positive direction. But again, the worry is about the capacity in the institutional structure, whether there's enough capacity and whether the institutional structure is good enough to implement these changes. Mm. It's we see some digitalization happening, but it's not about just making one website digitized, um, or to build a couple of portals, which had happened before. And what happened is after 1 or 2 years, maybe 3 years, these portals either disappear or stopped working. I think the question is whether there's capacity and institutional structure within the government to ensure that this digitalization or the increase of efficiency would continue. I think that is barely understood um, by most of the governments. They implement some of the things which worked for a few months because somebody would do it, either consultant or someone outside. But after that, people within the government has to do it, and if there's no institutional procedure, institutional structure, or the people with capacity to do those, that system will inevitably fail. So that is my largest worry. You asked about the tax system. Um, there are some positive measures being introduced to increase the tax collection. For example, providing point of sales machine to all the VAT registered companies. That kind of things are um, actions towards positive direction. But I think for me, again, this boils down to the Inland Revenue Department and its capacity, which is the main institution that collects the income tax and the value-added tax in Sri Lanka in from domestic industries. To carry out these things fairly well in an large informal economy like Sri Lanka, you require significant capacity. I again don't think that the IRD, Indian Department, does have that capacity. I don't see this budget looking enough into it. There's a small change, rather like the government had allocated money to recruit, I think, about 100 people to Indian Revenue Department. Mm, I think the department, to carry out the department's duties and increase its capacity, it requires more people, and it also requires much higher pay because requires revenue collection requires people with capacity trying to be step ahead of the taxpayers who will generally try to pay lesser taxes or dodge taxes. That's just human nature. So the revenue collection also authorities should be a couple of steps ahead, and for that you have to get really good people to the revenue collection authority. And I don't think Sri Lankans have done it. And I don't see a government having any proper plan to do it. And my biggest worry is that if you don't do that, you might meet the revenue targets this year, next year, and sustaining those or keep increasing those revenue ratios would not be possible unless you increase the capacity of the Inland Revenue Department.
So, in closing, my question is would to you would be on how much of a bearing this budget has on the country's foreign policy trajectory, particularly looking at what implications might the budget have for trade and foreign direct investments?
Actually, it's pretty positive. I mean, one would expect the left-leaning government to be less business friendly, but they are extremely business friendly, as indicated in the budget, because they mentioned specifically in the budget that they will allow private sector to be the key player in the new economic zones or the new free trade zones, and the government is very happy about it. They want private sector to come in and and take charge in those zones, which was very clear in President's speech. And also, President said that we want a lot of investment to the port sector. He invites people to invest and insists that this will be run as private-public partnership. So I think the signal for the private sector, or rather the foreign investors, has been pretty clear that this government welcomes them. And also they keep mentioning that uh, they try to eliminate corruption, so on and so forth, which is, I think, also a good signal. It's a mandate that they were elected on. And they they try to portray, or rather try to state the fact that the government welcomes private investors, foreign investors, and but all of them has to come to the proper route. There won't be any corruption will not be allowed. And if you come in the proper route, you have you will be provided with whatever the support that you need. So I think that signal is pretty clear. What it entails to foreign policy is a difficult question to answer, because sometimes in reality, certain countries would want preferential treatment for their state-owned enterprises or the companies in that country. For example, Chinese state-owned enterprises would ask for tax concessions to establish themselves in Sri Lanka. So we see with China, Port City getting tax concessions, so as the Hambantota Port getting tax concessions, because those SOEs requested and demanded those things. Same goes with India's Adani Port, which is now about to open the West Container Terminal together with Sri Lanka's largest conglomerate, John Keel's Holdings. They also got significant tax concessions under the Strategic Development Projects Act. So these are also strategic investments. They want their footings in Sri Lanka, which has been pretty clear in recent past that when the Chinese investment grows, Indians also want to significantly invest in Sri Lanka. And then for that, the budget has given a signal to say that we welcome anyone, and we will facilitate that process. We are not shutting down doors to anyone. So that message is clear. But in terms of how the government's going to the need of balance the investments that are driven geopolitically is yet to be seen. I think that is a big question, because investments are always not driven by commercial interest. Sometimes they could also be driven by geopolitical interest, particularly in the context of ongoing geopolitical rivalries and what we term as the Second Cold War. And in that context, the different governments would require different forms of concessions, which of course I didn't see anything on the budget, but I'm stating the challenge beyond what the government has stated, and how to balance the scales on such a case, because that would be the difficult task. Ideally, it would be really good that none of the countries would want their SOEs or their companies preferential treatment or any geopolitical interested investments, but in reality, that will not be the case. So we'll just have to wait and see on that one.
Right. So we were joined today for a discussion on the inaugural budget under the National People's Power government in Sri Lanka by Mr. Umesh Moramudali, who is a lecturer at the Department of Economics, the University of Colombo, Sri Lanka. Thank you for sharing your insights with us, Umesh.
Thank you, Rajni. It's pleasure to be with you and NUS podcast.
You are listening to South Asia Chat. To learn more about our work, please visit us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also get updates through social media. We are on X, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. Thank you.